Hi guys, in this video I'm going to cover some lecture material on taxes. The first half of the chapter on taxes and subsidies. This video will probably be a little longer than the next one I post up on subsidies because, as they point out in the textbook, a subsidy is just a negative tax. And so the reasoning is all identical. It's just doing everything on the other side of equilibrium from taxes. The videos that were posted by the textbook authors, Cowan and Tabarrok, I thought those were pretty good. So this is a supplemental video. I just want to go through some of the reasoning that they talked about for taxes, and then the next video, subsidies, and draw out a few points, maybe a little bit more clearer or in a little bit more detail than they did, and sort of summarize things for you for preparing for the second midterm, and hopefully this will also be helpful for your homework problems as well. So let's begin. I'm going to start by talking about why it doesn't matter whether we put the tax on buyers or sellers. The outcome is going to be exactly the same, okay, in terms of the price that the buyer pays and the price that the seller receives. So let's begin with a simple supply and demand graph like we have up here. Okay, now you'll note throughout these that I've kind of pre-drawn a number of things on my graphs to save some time. The type of tax we're thinking about is a commodity tax, where it's just a flat price per unit that gets charged to either the seller of the good, usually the seller of the good, or the buyer of the good, and that's called a commodity tax. Remember from our lecture on supply and demand, we talked about the determinants of supply, and one of those determinants was taxes and subsidies. And recall that the supply curve tells us what's the lowest price that a seller would be willing to accept for each unit of a good, okay, to be willing to actually sell or produce and then sell that unit. And this is typically going to be what it cost the seller to produce that unit, plus whatever their opportunity cost was of producing the unit. Now, when a government places a tax on a good and they charge the tax to the seller, meaning they're going to collect the money from the seller, if it's a commodity tax where, let's just say that it's $1 per unit, if the seller was willing to sell the very first unit for $1, because that's what it cost them to produce that first unit, well, now if the government is going to be charging them a second dollar to sell that good, this seller is not going to be willing to make that sale unless he gets enough money to cover the cost of production plus the $1 tax that he has to pay to the government. And so a tax on the sellers is just going to shift this supply curve up and to the left, or actually just up vertically, by an amount exactly equal to the tax that's been charged. So if it was a $1 tax, we would have a new supply curve. I'm going to call that supply curve ST. And ST would be $1 above the supply curve S at every point along ST. Now, oftentimes people think, well, if you put a tax on sellers, they're going to raise their price, and they're going to raise the price by an amount equal to the tax that you've levied on them. But it turns out that under most circumstances, that's not actually true. If the sellers were to increase their price by an amount equal to the tax, they would raise the price from right here at the old equilibrium to a point directly above, say $1 in this case, above the old price. Okay, but notice that that point there is not an equilibrium. So if the sellers tried to increase their price by that full dollar, at this new higher price, sellers would be willing to sell more units than buyers would be willing to purchase at that price. So it would create a surplus of goods in the market. And remember from our lecture on equilibrium, if there's a surplus in the market, that's going to push the price down. So the sellers are not going to be able to raise their prices usually by the full dollar. Instead, they're going to raise the price, but it would be by some smaller amount than $1. Okay, so that's the first point to take into consideration. Now, after the tax has been put in place, the price that the sellers would be charging to the buyers will be at this new equilibrium point, and we'll draw a dotted line over here. We're going to call that price PB. That's the price that the buyers would pay to the sellers. It's the price that they're charged. However, the sellers do not get to keep that entire price PB because the government is collecting a tax from them, right? $1 on every unit in this example. So if we go to that price that they're charging the sellers and we go directly down by $1, we're going to hit the old supply curve. That is the price that the sellers would receive. We're going to call that price PS, the price that the sellers would receive. Okay? This straight line here, that amount is equal to the tax that is being charged, all right, and being collected from the sellers. Okay? So what you can see is if you charge a tax to the sellers, or you charge a tax on the market and you collect it from the sellers, you're going to separate the prices that the buyer pays and the seller receives. In equilibrium, those prices are the same. And you can see that you're going to push the price up on the buyers relative to what it was in the old equilibrium, and you're going to push the price down on the sellers relative to what it was in the old equilibrium. Now, what if we didn't collect the tax from the sellers? We don't have to. You can imagine taxing the buyers instead, right? Collecting the tax from the buyers. And maybe that would work by having like two cash registers. There's one at the store where you pay money to the seller, and then right next to them there's a second cash register where a government agent collects the commodity tax from you. So what would that do? Well, this demand curve tells you how much a consumer would be, or all consumers would be willing to pay on each unit that they would purchase. And if you knew that you were going to have to pay the government a tax for every unit that you purchased, that's essentially going to reduce the amount that you would be willing to pay to the seller, right? So if this guy's willing to pay, let's say $50 for that first unit, that $50 is what he's willing to pay total. If he knows that he has to pay one of those dollars to the government, then the most he would be willing to pay to the seller would be the other $49. Okay, so to him it doesn't matter where the money goes. $50 is the most he's willing to pay. So just like a tax on the sellers is going to shift the supply curve up by $1 at every point, a tax that's collected from the buyers would shift the demand curve down by $1 at every point. And remember, this straight line here, that is the $1 tax. That means that this demand curve would end up crossing through this point right here because we're shifting down by $1. So you'd get this new demand curve that was lower than the old one. We'll call that demand curve DT. Okay? And so if you collected the tax from the buyers, notice that the new equilibrium would be here where the demand curve with the tax intersects the supply curve without a tax. That is the price that they would now be willing to pay to the sellers, all right? Which is exactly the same price that the sellers were netting when we taxed them. But the buyer doesn't get to just pay that low price PS. The buyer also has to send in the tax or pay that tax to the government. So the price the buyer pays is that price plus the dollar, which is PB, all right? Which again was exactly the same price that they were being charged when we taxed the seller instead. So that's why it doesn't matter whether you tax the buyer or the seller, because what's going to happen is either the supply curve is going to shift up by an amount equal to the tax, or the demand curve is going to shift down by an amount equal to the tax. And whichever side you're collecting the tax from loses that money to the government. Okay, so either way, you get the same price to the buyer, same price to the seller. Now, what is convenient about knowing that fact is when we're analyzing a tax policy, we don't need to actually shift either of these curves, and we don't even need to think about who the tax is being collected from. Okay, that's where we get to the tax wedge analysis that your textbook refers to and that you probably saw already in the videos by Cowan and Tabarrok. If we know that there's a $1 tax, then all we have to do, I'm going to now move on to this fresh supply and demand graph. We just need to say, okay, I know that the government is going to be collecting $1 from somebody. So you just find the point on the graph where the supply and demand curve are exactly $1 apart. Wherever that is, I'm just going to say it's right there. wherever that is, you draw this straight line, which we call the tax wedge. And wherever that tax wedge hits the demand curve, that's going to tell you the price that the buyers have to pay. And wherever it hits the supply curve, the tax wedge will tell you that's the price that the sellers receive. Okay, so we get a nice clean graph. By the way, we call this, you can think of this as being called a tax wedge for one of two reasons. One is the way that the authors show you in their slides is they start with this line to the left and then they push it in towards equilibrium until it gets wedged in between the demand curve and the supply curve. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it, though, is that when you tax a market, you are driving a wedge between the prices that the buyer pays and that the seller receives. In equilibrium, that price is the same for both the buyer and the seller. With a tax, there's a wedge between the prices that they have to pay. Okay? And note also that on this graph, the tax is always going to be equal to the price that the buyers pay minus the price that the sellers receive. That will come in handy as we think about a few other things a couple pages from now. All right? So let's move on. The next topic or the next thing to think about is this notion of tax incidence. They use that term in their Cowan and Tabarrok do in their slideshows, their videos, but I don't believe they ever actually define this term in the videos. And so what you need to understand about tax incidence, what it means is who pays? Does the bulk of the tax, does it fall on the buyers or does it fall on the sellers, or is it split, say, 50-50? And the way that you answer that question is you compare the new prices that the buyer has to pay and the seller has to pay, seller receives. You compare those prices to the old equilibrium price. And the farther their price is away from equilibrium, the larger a share of the tax that side of the market is going to pay. All right. So let's start with the authors point out that the big determining factor is not who sends the check to the government. That makes no difference in terms of economically who pays the tax. That's just an accounting nicety, right? Who writes the check. The actual cost is going to have to do with who gets stuck with a more favorable or less favorable price relative to the old equilibrium price. And the only thing that's going to matter here is how elastic is demand relative to how elastic is supply. Okay, so here we have one example where demand is very elastic, supply is very inelastic. And so if we take a tax wedge, and I'm going to make this a large tax wedge so that the effect is really obvious. We wouldn't expect most tax wedges to actually be this big. But draw that tax wedge there where it hits the demand curve. That gives you the price the buyers have to pay. Where it hits the supply curve, the price that the sellers receive. Okay? And so it should be pretty obvious to you that the price that the buyers have to pay is pretty close to the old equilibrium price. In other words, they don't bear much of the cost of the tax. All right. The sellers, on the other hand, their price has been forced down way below what it was in equilibrium. And so we would say most of the incidence of the tax falls on the sellers, not on the buyers. So you'll notice in this case, the elastic side of the market was the buyers, the consumers, and their price didn't go up very much. The inelastic side of the market was the sellers. Their price dropped by a lot. So in this case, you can see that the adage that they give you is elasticity equals escape. That holds true in this example. Now, come down to this next graph, and let's try a tax wedge that's basically the same size. Again, we're going to make it extreme so that the difference becomes clear. Price the buyers would pay is way up there. Price the sellers receive is down here close to equilibrium. So in this case, the elastic side of the market is the sellers. So their price stays pretty close to what their old equilibrium price was. The buyers are more inelastic in their demand, and so the price gets driven up on them. They end up paying more of a share of the tax, a larger share of the tax. Okay, so elasticity equals escape. The side of the market that's more elastic pays less of the tax. The side of the market that is more inelastic pays more of the tax. And that makes sense from the perspective, the explanation that they gave to you for the intuition is, look, the side of the market that is elastic, they have a lot of good options. Okay, instead of say buying in this market, these buyers can go do something else, right? Maybe this is the market for Pepsi, and so if there's a tax that's placed just on Pepsi, not on any other soft drinks, well, then they can go quickly and buy Coca-Cola, which is not being taxed, or they can buy RC Cola, which is not being taxed. So they're going to get out of this market really quickly. Coke, in comparison, doesn't have as many things that it could be doing with its resources. All right, it has fewer good substitutes for shutting down its Coca-Cola plants and producing something else instead. So they can't get out of the market very quickly. They're stuck paying most of the tax. Okay. Another way that you could think about this is if you have a tax wedge, that tax wedge is of a given height, right? A given distance. And so it is going to force a total price change equal to the tax per unit. Okay. Now, in order to get, and it's going to force that price change, which is also going to result in a change in the total quantity. So here's the equilibrium quantity QE. Once you put the tax in place, the total number of units that trade will be down here, QT, right? So we know there's going to be a reduction in trade equal to the distance between these two quantities. Well, looking at the supply and the demand curve, you have to say, how much do we need to raise the price to get the buyers to stop buying that number of units? Well, demand's pretty elastic, and so you don't have to raise the price on them very much to get them to reduce their consumption back here to QT. The sellers, on the other hand, have a pretty inelastic supply curve, and so you have to cut the price on them by quite a bit to get them to reduce their production from QE to QT. Okay, and exactly the same reasoning goes here. Here it is the buyers who are more inelastic. So to get them to reduce their consumption, you'd have to push the price up on them by quite a bit. For the sellers, they're pretty elastic, and so cutting the price by just a little bit is going to get all of the sellers necessary out of the market to reduce the quantity from QE to QT. Now, in the videos, the authors gave you an example of this situation here where you have elastic demand and inelastic supply. And the example had to do with the market for labor. In the market for labor, the demand curve is the employers, right? That's how much they'd be willing to pay for each additional, say, hour of work or each additional worker. The supply of labor is given by the workers. How much would you be willing to work for a given wage? Okay, and they pointed out your employers have quite a few options in terms of, they can ship jobs overseas, right? They could open up factories in other countries that have, say, more lax labor laws. They can replace people with machines, right? Get robots to do some of the work for you, and you don't need as many workers. Or just shut down in a particular industry and move to a different industry that's, say, less regulated or less taxed. So demand tends to be fairly elastic. Supply, on the other hand, is more inelastic. Workers have fewer good substitutes for working. They need to earn wages. Unless you're somebody who's really close to retirement age, then maybe your supply curve for labor is going to be more elastic. But for most people, for most of their lives, they are going to need to keep working even if the wage is fairly low because they've got bills that they need to pay, right? So they gave you the example of Social Security that most of the burden of Social Security tax probably falls on the workers. It drives the wages that they get paid, the after-tax wages down pretty low, even though on paper the government charges half of this money to your employer and half of it from you. It's really the worker who's paying almost all of it. Then they also gave you the example of the healthcare mandate. And you may be able to hear in the background there's somebody knocking at the door of my bedroom. Sorry about that. I've got 5 kids and sometimes they demand my attention, but we're going to soldier on. Healthcare mandate. So if you require workers to be covered, that is a cost that needs to be borne by somebody, and it's probably paid for primarily by the workers themselves, not picked up by their employers. Okay, I'm going to give you one last example of that, and that is for paid parental leave. With paid parental leave, that's been in the headlines quite a bit, where a lot of politicians are saying, look, the United States is one of very few industrialized countries where you're not guaranteed paid time off when you have a child, right? And so the idea is we should pass a law that says if you have a child, you get a certain number of weeks, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 12 weeks, where not only do you get to keep your job if you take that time off to stay home with your child, but you also have to be paid for your time off. Well, that's effectively like a tax, okay? For every worker that an employer has, they are faced with the possibility of having to pay these folks even when they're not working, okay? So their expense of hiring people goes up, particularly of hiring women, because they're more likely on average to take time off with a new child than men, and in particular young women, right? Older, say middle-aged and older women, middle-aged and older men in particular, very unlikely to take parental leave, okay, for a new baby. So anyway, the question is who's going to bear most of the cost of that paid parental leave? Well, this suggests that most of the cost of that policy is going to fall on the workers, not on the employers. Because when you force the employers to have this additional tax or this additional cost that functions like a tax, effectively they're going to push the wages down that they would pay to workers, and they'll be bearing only a small portion of that tax. What about down here where the supply curve is more elastic and the demand curve is more inelastic? Well, there, what's relevant, or an example of this would be something like tariffs, particularly on Mexico and China. Okay, remember the 2016 election, Donald Trump made an election promise, which was he's going to build a wall on the southern border of the United States with Mexico. And more than that, he was going to get Mexico to pay for it, right? How do you get Mexico to pay for it? Well, his answer was, we're going to put tariffs on goods from Mexico. We'll collect taxes on those goods that they send to us. And because we'll be collecting those taxes from Mexican goods, it's going to be Mexicans who are paying the tax bill. Okay? Well, what our economic analysis of tax incidence tells us is it doesn't matter if the people writing the check to the federal government are Mexican nationals or U.S. nationals. What really matters is the change in prices, right? Who's going to bear most of the tax? And it could be a situation like this, where if consumers in the United States are really elastic in their consumption of goods from Mexico and China, and the suppliers in those countries are very inelastic, then when you impose the tariff, the prices will go up just a little bit on consumers. Prices that the sellers receive will go down by a lot. And so in this kind of a situation, it might be reasonable to say, yeah, Mexico's paying for the wall, or they're paying the majority of the cost for the wall. However, it turns out that in the last few years, economists have done studies looking at the tax incidence, and what they've found is almost entire, what they call almost complete cost pass-through, meaning that the price to buyers on goods imported from Mexico and from China have gone up by an amount almost exactly equivalent to the tariffs that we're placing on them, which tells you the sellers in those countries have the more elastic curve, which makes sense. The United States is a large market, but it's not the only place they could sell their goods, right? They can also export to the European Union. They can export their goods to Canada. They can export their goods to Australia, to South America. There's lots of places where these countries can send their goods instead. And apparently, American consumers are less eager to change their behavior, okay, as the prices go up. So they have more inelastic demand for those goods than the sellers have elastic supply curves. And so it turns out that most of the cost of the tariffs we've been imposing on these countries are actually being paid for by U.S. citizens, not by foreign nationals. And so it turns out that even if we pay for the wall entirely through tariffs, it is American citizens who are paying most of that cost. Okay, next up, I want to talk about some relevant formulas from this chapter. Okay, remember that in equilibrium, if you've got a market in equilibrium, all of this area here is the available gains from trade, and they're going to be split between the consumer and the producer. Consumer surplus is everything below the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. CS, consumer surplus. And I'm going to label these. Remember, YS is where the supply curve hits the x-axis, and YD is where the demand curve hits the x-axis, the y-axis. So our formula for consumer surplus when a market is untaxed is the y-intercept of the demand curve minus the equilibrium price times the equilibrium quantity divided by 2. That'll give you the area of this blue triangle. Producers get the rest of the gains from trade. They get everything below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve. So producer surplus was equal to the equilibrium price minus the y-intercept of the supply curve times the equilibrium quantity divided by 2. And total gains from trade, which I'm going to call TGT, total gains from trade, that's just the sum of these two surpluses, consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Okay, this you already know. What happens when there is a tax? Now things get more complicated because there's multiple prices and there's more than just two areas that carve up this triangle between the demand and supply curve to the left of equilibrium. All right, so we're going to start by thinking about the prices. Remember that here's the price the buyers have to pay. Their consumer surplus is going to be this triangle right here. Everything above the price they have to pay, but below the demand curve, below the prices they would have been willing to pay. That's consumer surplus. And again, I'm going to label this point here YD. So consumer surplus when there's a tax is now going to be Y with a D subscript, not minus the equilibrium price, but minus the price the buyers actually pay, PB. And they are not going, we're not going to multiply that by the quantity of units in equilibrium. Instead, we're going to find the quantity of units that trade when there's a tax, QT. QT will be the length of this triangle. Then we divide by 2. What about the producers? Well, for them, we have to look at the price the sellers are going to receive, PS, that's down here. And just like in the equilibrium case, we're still going to be giving the surplus below the price that the sellers receive and above the supply curve. We're still going to give that to the producers as producer surplus. But now that's going to change our formula. It's going to be PS, not PE, but PS minus the y-intercept of the supply curve. which remember is this point right here. Multiply that by the quantity of units that are trading, divide by 2. Okay? Then we have two more areas here, two more shapes. I'm going to start with this rectangle on the left. This represents all of the revenues that the government is going to raise, right? This tax wedge tells us how much they're charging per unit. And QT, this line here, that represents how many units are trading now that we've imposed that tax. So there are QT trades. We multiply that by the tax per unit, and that's going to give us the tax revenues. So we'll call that TR, and that's going to simply be equal to the price the buyers pay minus the price the sellers receive. That tells us the height of this rectangle. I'm going to multiply by the length of the rectangle, which is QT, and that will be the total revenues. Then we have one last area to think about, and that's this triangle here, which I'm going to mark in red. This red triangle is called the deadweight loss. Okay, what is the deadweight loss? Well, when you impose this tax, the buyers and sellers stop trading when they get to this quantity QT. Okay, because if they were to trade additional units, when you look at the cost of the sellers, it's greater than the price that they would be receiving for their good, and so they would lose money on that transaction. They're not going to be willing to sell. Same idea with the buyers. The value to these buyers here is less than the price that they would have to pay to both the seller and the government put together, and so they're not going to willingly purchase those units. But even though the prices are too low for the sellers and too high for the buyers, notice that the buyers would be willing to pay more than what it costs the sellers to produce those units. So these are trades that would be profitable, that would generate extra welfare, gains from trade, if we would allow the buyers and sellers to trade at this equilibrium price. But we are not allowing that due to the tax, so these trades just don't happen, and that is a deadweight loss. Okay, going to shorten that to DWL. What is the deadweight loss? Well, the height of this triangle is going to be the price the buyers pay minus the price the sellers receive. And the length is going to be the difference between the number of units that would trade in equilibrium and the number of units that are actually trading now that we have the tax. QE minus QT. Sorry, I'm getting a little cramped there. And then since it's a triangle, we divide by 2. Okay. Now, up here, the total gains in trade were just the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. In this situation, the total gains from trade will be equal to the consumer surplus, although notice it's a smaller amount than it was before, plus the producer surplus, which is also a smaller area than it was before, plus the tax revenue. Okay, these tax revenues are still gains from trade. They just don't go to the consumers or the producers anymore. They get transferred from the buyers and sellers in the market to the government. Okay, but the government, somebody is getting that money, so it still counts as total gains from trade. This area here, the deadweight loss, that is not captured by anyone. And so an economist would tell you that the cost of a tax is this deadweight loss. It's not the way we're used to thinking of it as citizens. If you hear a politician railing against a tax, what they're going to tell you is the cost of the tax is this tax revenue, right? They're going to say, you know, if we impose this tax, it's going to cost $2 billion to the taxpayer. Okay, fair enough. That's true. But those tax revenues go somewhere, right? They get transferred away from the consumers and away from the producers to the government. The economic cost is going to be this deadweight loss. How big of an area is that? Okay, how many transactions that we would have had without the tax are we now losing because we have the tax? All right, and that brings us to the final concept, which is, which are the best goods to tax? All right, now remember what they talked about in let's see, I think it was the third video that was posted. Okay, you got supply curves that we're going to keep constant. Okay, I'm making them flat, I'm making them perfectly elastic just to illustrate what happens when the demand curve is more elastic or less elastic. Okay, and now let's take a tax wedge of a given size. Let's say that's our tax wedge. Well, the price that the sellers receive is going to be here at the supply curve. The price that the buyers pay goes up. Notice in this case, this is one case where the tax actually would be completely transferred to the buyers. The sellers are so elastic, they're so responsive that they're not going to bear any of this tax. It would all go on the back of the buyers. Okay, so let me see. We have that tax wedge results in a higher price to the buyers, and the dead weight loss is going to be this triangle here. Right. Now let's take a tax wedge and let's try to make sure it's exactly the same height. I believe it's about like that. Down here where demand is more inelastic, there's the price the buyers pay. Now notice that the deadweight loss in this case is this triangle, and this is substantially smaller than that one is. And that just has to be true basically geometrically, okay? This demand curve is steeper, so we can get the tax wedge closer to the old equilibrium, right? There's more space. This demand curve being flatter, being more elastic, means that tax wedge is going to get stuck at a greater distance from the equilibrium. Well, if we know that there's going to be a bigger distance between QT and QE, but the height of these two tax wedges is the same, then by definition, that's got to have a bigger deadweight loss than this one is going to have. All right. And what this tells you is you're better off taxing things that have a more inelastic demand than things that have a more elastic demand. In other words, you're going to raise more tax revenue, or you can raise the same tax revenue with a lower economic cost, a lower deadweight loss, if you tax where you've got inelastic demand relative to more elastic demand. Same thing is true of supply, by the way. If we made these supply curves really steep, we could push the tax wedge even closer to the old equilibrium, okay? But I just want to focus on demand in this case. And they give you the example of like yachts, okay? Back in the 90s, we taxed yachts at a pretty high premium. I think it was 10%. And, you know, quantity demanded was cut in half, basically, as a result of that. So it didn't raise all that much revenue because the buyers could just easily substitute into buying something else, either buying yachts in another country or just buying other luxury goods instead. Another example would be, like I brought up before, like if you just taxed Coca-Cola, that would be a pretty stupid tax because there's lots of substitutes for Coca-Cola that consumers could shift into. So you'd get a big deadweight loss in the Coca-Cola market without raising very much revenue. Down here, on the other hand, you have a good like maybe, let's say, gasoline. In the United States, at least, gasoline demand for gasoline is very inelastic. So it doesn't distort markets by very much to tax gasoline in the U.S. and especially in California. And perhaps that's why we have such high gas taxes. I looked them up today. Gas tax in California is like 61.4 cents per gallon. Okay, and that, of course, most of that ends up in the final price that you have to pay. Another thing, though, to keep in mind is if you tax all goods simultaneously, like this might be the market for Coca-Cola, this could be the market for all goods. And while you can easily substitute from Coca-Cola to some other brand of soda, if all of the goods that are being sold in an economy, if they all have the same tax on them, well, it's very difficult to substitute out of one good and into another, right? So, Lee, there you go. I'm sure you guys can hear my kids roughhousing in the hallway. Apologies for that, but I'm basically not allowed on campus now due to COVID-19. So I'm going to call it good for this video, and the next one that I put together will be on subsidies. Hopefully it'll be a little quieter in the background when I do that. All right, take care, guys. Remember to be flexible, communicate, stay awesome.